Hello and welcome to Azam Sharp Weekly. In this video, I'm going to show you that how you can implement lean controllers in iOS. We'll be working on a very small app that is going to fetch some posts, some data, JSON data from a web API, and it's going to display it in a table view control. Let me first go ahead and run the application so that you have a much better idea of what we will be building. The application works as expected and it displays the title and the body of a particular web API and it's displayed on the screen. Everything works fine. But if you look at the post table view controller, this is what our controller actually looks like. There is a bunch of code in the view controller. It's not truly massive view controller, but we can definitely go over there and refactor it and move the code into different files, different classes, and make the controller itself much leaner. So let's go ahead and get started with this. The first thing we see is that we are making a network request right inside our post table view controller. It works and we can display and get all the data, that's perfectly fine. But what if we want to use the same request later on? We most probably will go ahead and copy the code and paste it somewhere else. And copy pasting is not really a good idea when you are building applications. It's going to have technical debt, and then if you change something, you have to change all the different places. So instead of this code lying in the post table view controller, let's go ahead and create a file or a class called web service, which will be responsible for making all of these requests. I'm going to go ahead and select the Swift file, going to add it, and call it web service. You can obviously call your file anything you want. Inside over here, I'm going to create a web service which will allow me to fetch information. Let's start by creating our web service class. I'm going to call it web service. The first thing we need is the load post function, which will have a completion because the web service is asynchronous, so it is going to return us the data asynchronously. So we are going to call that callback once we have the web service returning something. It is going to return me a post eventually, and right now I do have a post class, and it's going to be returning me post in a closure. Closure is not returning anything, and that's fine. Let's go ahead and build that first. Okay, that's great. The first thing I need is the URL. Now, since this is a load post, I'm simply going to add the post URL. In an actual application, you can actually create a URL helper, which is going to return you different URLs. But right now, that's fine. We are simply going to use the URL inside the load post function. After that, we can actually go ahead and use the URL session.shared.data task. We can pass in the URL and get some sort of a response back. So let's go ahead and pass in the URL, and we are going to get some sort of a response back, which will give us the data, the response, and the error. Don't forget to call resume. That's number one thing that people forget, to call resume, and then they start debugging that what just happened and why we are not getting the data. After that, we are going to go ahead and unwrap our data, and we're also going to make sure that the error is actually nil. Else, if error is not nil, then we can simply go ahead and call the completion handler with nil because, well, something bad happened and we didn't really get the data. After that, we are going to go ahead and get the post, and using the JSON decoder, so this code is going to get executed if we do get some sort of data back. We're going to decode the data and we're going to send it back. Make sure that you use try optional so that it doesn't blow up if your decoding fails. If let post equals to post, basically what we're trying to do now is we're simply going to pass in the post. We can actually go ahead and pass the post over here, simply in the completion. So let's go ahead and do that. Completion handler and post. Great. Let's go ahead and build that. Okay, so our web service is done. We have created one function in the web service called loadPost, and which will return us a callback, which will either return us nil if there's something wrong, or it will return us post. So you can see that we have pretty much done all of this. So this is inside the post table view controller. We can actually replace all of this stuff eventually. All right. Let's move to this stuff: number of sections, number of rows in section, and cell for row at index path. Currently, all of these things are inside the post table view controller. But we can actually create our own data source and put all of this stuff in the data source. So let's go ahead and add a new file. And you can call your data source anything you want. I'm simply going to call it post data source, data source. There we go. And let's get started with creating the post data source. So post data source, which is going to inherit from NS object and also use the UI table view data source protocol, which is actually part of UIKit. So make sure you import UIKit also. There we go. All right. Now, UI table view data source, we need to implement a couple of different functions. So let's go ahead and do that. The first one is the number of sections, and I can actually put it over here, number of sections. Then the second one is number of rows in section. We are going to return self.post.count. We don't really have anything called post yet. Don't worry, we will get that. And the last one is the cell for row at index path, which actually is going to return you an actual cell. Let's go ahead and do that also. There we go. There are a lot of errors right now, and it's complaining a lot of different places, mainly saying that what exactly is post. So let's go ahead and create a private property and call it post. And we can also initialize the post with an empty object. Now, how will this data get to the table view controller? We're going to create a small delegate, which will be a post data source delegate, which does not exist, by the way. We're going to create the delegate right now. The delegate that we're about to create will contain one function, which we call post data source did fetch post. And this delegate is going to get fired whenever we are ready and whenever we have the data. So at which point do we have the data? Well, we have to create that function to first call the web service, which in turn is going to return us the data. So let's go ahead and first create our initializer init. We're going to override the default init. We'll start by calling our main init or the base init, which is super.init, and then calling fetch post, the function that we are going to implement now. The fetch post is a function which is going to call the web service we just developed a few moments ago, get all the posts, and then assign the post to this variable, and then call the delegate. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and create a function which is called fetch post. And I'm going to use a web service that we created earlier, web service.loadPost. I'm going to use the trailing closure. So there we go. We get the post over here. So post in, and then I can say if let post equals to post. Basically, I'm unwrapping the post. Self dot post equals to post, and then self dot delegate. Basically, I'm going to go ahead and tell the delegate to fire this particular function. Let's go ahead and build this. Everything builds successfully. And now is the fun part, because we are going to go to the post table view controller and start deleting most of the stuff that we have. So we'll start with over here, the populate post function. Pretty long function. Let's go ahead and delete all of that. All of that stuff is actually getting done by the web service, so we don't have to do that anymore. Number of sections in table view, number of rows in the sections, and number of cell for row at index path, all of that is actually being done by the data source. The only thing we need to do is to create the data source. So let's go ahead and create this var data source, which is of type data post post data source. So there we go, post data source. I'm going to use this force unwrapping because I am going to initialize it right over here. So it's not going to blow up anyway. All right, so there we go. Great. Now we need to go ahead and set the data source. So self.datasource.delegate equals to self. This is the delegate that we are setting, so that self, which in this case is the post table view controller, will become the delegate. But we also have to specify the delegate over here. So post data source delegate. And the final thing we need to do is to set the table view data source, or table view.data source equals to self.datasource. If we want to conform to the post data source delegate, we need to implement the post data source did fetch post function. So let's go ahead and do that. And inside this function, we are simply going to call tableview.reloadData. Let's go ahead and build that. Let's go check a couple of things. The first thing that we are checking over here in the web service is when we are calling this completion, we are currently calling it on a background thread. So that's not good. Make sure that you always call this completion dispatch queue. So we are going to switch to the main thread or the UI thread and going to call that completion, calling in the post. And let's go ahead and build that. Great. I think everything is set up correctly. Now go ahead and take a look at your view controller, your post table view controller, and it looks nice. Now, one other thing that you can also do is inside the post data source, we are calling the load post, and then this returns an asynchronous function which then captures the self. So we can actually go over here and say weak self, just to make sure that this doesn't really retain SECL, and there we go. All right. So this means that it's going to be a weak reference. It's not going to hold the reference to our self, which self in this case will be post data source, and post data source will be assigned eventually to, you can see over here, to the table view data source. Let's go ahead and run this and see that if everything behaves as before or not. And there we go. So everything works exactly as before. It's not going to be fast or slow or anything like that. But now you can see that your view controller is much lighter and it is much controlled. So anytime you want to do anything with the web service, you're going to go to the web service class. Anytime you want to do with the data source, you're going to go to the post data source class. So everything is organized nicely in this case. And that is the way that you control the massive size of your view controllers. If you want to learn more about how you can tame the massive view controllers, then check out my course on Udemy, which is called A Complete Guide to Lean Controllers in iOS. This is 4.5 hours of course which goes through multiple applications, and it allows you to create lean controllers from a very, very massive controllers. So you are going to learn a lot of different techniques, not only for the lean controllers, but also how to create custom controls, how to create generic data providers and data sources, and securing tab bar, networking, and building UI control extensions. This is a great course if you are already an iOS developer and you want to take your skills to the next level, so you can learn how to segment or structure your code much nicely. The link to the description is, or the link to the coupon is actually in the description, so I highly recommend that you go ahead and check out this course. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, let me know.